JBS presents the Hampton Synagogue's Author Discussion Series with Rabbi Avraham Bronstein.
My name is Glenn Dorskin. Welcome to the Hampton Synagogue. The Hampton Synagogue Author Discussion Series is a cultural highlight of our summer season, both from members of our congregation and our many visitors from across the Hamptons. I am proud to serve as series chair, and it is my great pleasure to share our past season with you, our global congregation, in celebration of Jewish Book Month.
Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Jeffrey Toobin.
Okay. The first question I have is, it's really a two-part question. The question is, when did you first get the idea? What inspired you to take on presidential pardons as a topic that you wanted to devote a book-length exploration of? And part two of the question has to do with the makeup of the book. The book really is a history, as Glenn introduced, of presidential pardons going back to George Washington all the way up to Donald Trump. So everybody, basically. But the focus of the book, the main story that you analyze, is Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon.
Right.
So I was just wondering, having read the book, did you start by wanting to explore that particular pardon, but in order to do it, you felt like you had to analyze pardons in general? Or were you studying presidential pardons as a topic, and something really attracted you about the Ford pardon of Nixon that made you spend so much time on it?
Well, let me explain. Let me talk about it. The idea for the book. Mm-hmm. Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon on August 9th, 1974. That's a long time ago, but there are people in this room who were alive in 1974. I think a few. And it was the story that introduced me to politics. Mm-hmm. I was born in 1960. Watergate was the first story I remember following in the news. So I've always had a special interest in it. And there's a tremendous literature of Watergate, starting with the books that were written right then, like All the President's Men by Woodward and Bernstein and Blind Ambition by John Dean. And the controversy over the pardon, the Nixon pardon, was something that was really, something I remembered. It's one of the first, probably the first political event I remembered. So that's one reason I was interested. But the other reason, I think, was more crass. In 2023, by that point, it became clear that Donald Trump was going to be the nominee of the Republican Party. And he was already talking about pardoning the January 6 rioters. Mm-hmm. That was a part of his campaign from the very beginning. So I knew that if he won, that was going to be an issue in the beginning of 2025, when I knew I could get the book out. Plus, one of the most interesting things about the Nixon pardon is how the historical reputation of the pardon has changed over time. At the time, in 1974, it was perceived and was a political disaster for Gerald Ford. Many people believe that it was one of the things that cost him the election to Jimmy Carter in 1976. But as time has passed, a lot of people have changed their minds, including Ted Kennedy, for example, and Bob Woodward, both of whom later said, the pardon was a good idea. And I knew as a result of that if Kamala Harris had won, there would have been pressure on her to pardon Donald Trump as a healing gesture in the way that Ford's pardon of Nixon has been perceived. So I figured that pardons were going to be in the news in early 2020. I don't claim any great insight to who was going to win, but I figured either way they were going to be. It's a good time for a book, and also just the fact that there have been books about Nixon, there have been books about Ford, there have been books about Watergate. There's never been a book just about the pardon itself. And I bet, and I think it was a correct bet, that there was plenty of enough story about the pardon to make it worthwhile. So I'm sorry, that's a long answer, but
it's a good answer.
That's
that's
the answer.
So I'm curious also, just as far as how the book was composed. You've written books of history before, and you've written books and you've done work in journalism before. And this book is kind of a combination of both of those, because for all the contemporary presidents and the contemporary pardons, the book feels like journalism. For everything from Watergate going backwards, and there's a lot of stuff on Watergate where the relevant people aren't alive anymore, or certainly before that, it's also a work of history, whether it's political history or constitutional history. And I'm just wondering, as an author, how do you kind of navigate that line between history and journalism?
Well, this is very interesting because this is the book, I've written 10 books. This is the book that is most like history. And there's an interesting comparison in my own mind and in my own work between this and the Patty Hearst book, American Eras. Both the kidnapping of Patty Hearst and the pardon of Richard Nixon took place in 1974. She was kidnapped in February, the pardon was in August. But there was a big difference journalistically between the two. I wrote the Patty Hearst book about 10 years ago. Virtually everyone involved in the Patty Hearst story was still alive when I was reporting that book, and I got to interview all the main participants.
Just the word that you're using. You were reporting the book.
Right, very much as a journalist. Mm-hmm. Because most of the people in 1974 who were involved with the story were in their 20s and 30s. And, fortunately, people don't die 40 years later. Mm-hmm. But most of the people involved in the Nixon story, in the Nixon-Ford story, were in their 50s in 1970, the mid-1970s. And I wrote the book 10 years later. So almost everyone was gone. Mm-hmm. So this book was written really from the historical record, with one important exception, which is John Dean, the White House counsel under Nixon, also someone who was a contributor with me at CNN. So I got to know John pretty well. And it was a really surreal and wonderful experience, because one of the resources I got to use in writing this book were the famous White House tapes. And John Dean is on a lot of those tapes. And sometimes and all the tapes now are online, and sometimes I would sort of be listening to the tapes, and I would just call John Dean and say, John, what did you mean on September 3rd, 1973, when you said X, Y, and Z? Which was sort of a wonderful opportunity. And John is a very generous person and someone with a great memory, and someone who studied Watergate as well as being a protagonist. And he gave me answers.
It's really cool. So it's an interesting place for you to be then, because it's a book of mostly history, but you're almost telling it from a journalistic perspective.
Correct. And also, as I said in my initial answer, I was writing it because of its direct political significance today. I mean, you can write any book with an eye towards its contemporary significance. The Civil War is still meaningful today. The American Revolution is still. But this was very. The connections were direct. I like that. I like the intersection of journalism and history. I don't feel that the line between them is it's a very clear line. But I liked the going back, and also just from a purely individual perspective. I've written books that were very much on the news. Like my OJ book came out right after the OJ case. About the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal right afterwards, the Mueller investigation right afterwards. I liked writing a book where I wasn't competing with 10 other books at the same time, where I had the subject more or less to myself, where I wasn't fighting with other journalists to interview the same people. That to me is something that I enjoyed about this book.
No, that resonates. I mean, I subscribe to the notion that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.
Right.
And you definitely feel kind of those overlapping waves when you read a book like this, because it gives you a sense of the context and what was happening before, and you see kind of how everything interlocks just a little bit, and things aren't just coming out of nowhere. So let me ask you, let's take a step back and talk about presidential pardons to begin with, because the whole idea of the president being able to stand above the law and pardon somebody, it seems weird. It's not a power that you would normally think a president should have, right? Literally, it's giving the president the right to break the law. Somebody broke the law, they were sentenced, the system works a certain way. And I'm just wondering where that came from in the first place. It seems like a monarchical power, which is exactly what the framers of the Constitution were trying to militate against. So how did it happen?
The pardon is an aberration in the Constitution. The fundamental idea behind the Constitution is checks and balances. The three branches of government all have powers that intersect and are at least intended to make sure that there are limits on the authority of each of the branches of government, and that's why the president can appoint judges, but they have to be confirmed by the Senate. That's why his cabinet has to be confirmed by the Senate. That's why legislature, the president can sign bills, but it can be overridden by two-thirds majority. All of those intersections are designed as a check or balance. The pardon is not. The pardon is the part of the Constitution that comes most directly from the powers of the King of Great Britain, who has that power. And as my father used to say, to make a long story unbearable, after the American Revolution, there were the Articles of Confederation, which was the governing document for the initial few years of the decade, which were failures. And they did not, there was no president, there was no central executive authority. And the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was designed to create a system that would last. Alexander Hamilton, even before he was as famous as he is now, was the chief advocate for a strong president, someone who could push the country forward in a much more direct way than Congress could. And he was also the leading advocate for the pardon power. And he had two very interesting justifications for it. One is pretty obvious and conventional, which was the idea of mercy. He understood, and I think correctly then and now, that the justice system sometimes ensnares people even if they're guilty, and punishes them too harshly. And there should be a vehicle for lowering those sentences. But the other reason was he thought it was an exercise of presidential power that could diffuse controversy, and particularly rebellions. And even in the presidency of George Washington initially, there was something called the Whiskey Rebellion, which was a tax revolt way out west, which meant Pennsylvania. And there were several people who were charged with treason as a result. But Washington issued pardons to them because he thought that would diffuse the controversy rather than make them martyrs. Much more consequentially, Abraham Lincoln did much the same thing after the Civil War, or toward the end of the Civil War. He died before the end of the Civil War. But he thought that pardoning the soldiers, not the generals, but the soldiers in the Confederacy, as long as they pledged allegiance to the Union, would help to unify the country. So I think Hamilton was prescient on that, on both counts.
Was the pardon a good idea?
Well, this is a question that has come up often, as I've talked about the book, and I can understand why the question comes up because, not to give you too much of a spoiler here, but there were a lot of bad pardons discussed in this book, a lot of pardons that I think should not have been granted. But I do believe that the pardon power is a good thing, and I'm glad we have it, because there will always be political pressure on a president and in the government to be tough on crime and to be tough on criminals. And I think we always need a safety valve to try to let some people out because, there are 150,000 people in federal prison in the United States. I guarantee you they all shouldn't be there. Now, most of them should, but not all of them. And the fact that we have a system that allows those people to get out or not go in the first place, I think is a good thing. My solution to this problem of the pardon is we need better presidents. So I'd like you all to get to work on that. But it's the pardon power is not the problem.
That's a very sad laugh line.
Yeah, right.
I was thinking about that because reading through the book, I was wondering what makes a good pardon and what makes a bad pardon. And I came up with a little bit of a taxonomy.
Oh,
and,
good. I'd like to hear that.
I want to know what you think about it. So on one hand, you have pardons that happen when a president realizes that conditions have changed somewhat from when the laws were originally passed. So let's say, for example, committing treason is punishable by death, but after the Civil War, that outcome wouldn't have been good for the country, or after the Whiskey Rebellion. Let's say people could look at Barack Obama pardoning hundreds or thousands of low-level drug offenders as a way of saying these laws are out of date, they were passed under a certain circumstance, these people wouldn't be in jail now, and therefore there's no reason to keep them there given the fact that circumstances have changed. And those pardons happen on a wide scale, All Civil War fighters or generals, That's Carter pardoning everyone who ran to Canada during Vietnam. That's Obama pardoning hundreds of people as well. Another level of pardons could be a president acting towards an individual out of a sense of clemency or humanitarianism. Somebody's been in jail for a long time. They've reformed themselves. The system isn't going to let them out, but really the right thing to do is to let them live out their lives in freedom. Those two we understand, and I think that those are kind of along the lines of what you were speaking about when you mentioned Hamilton's justifications for the power in the first place. Right? The third level, the bad pardons, are when it seems like a president is acting to benefit either himself, it's always himself, or to benefit his friends or those who are close to him. You go through many examples of that in the book, whether it's Bill Clinton pardoning Mark Rich, whether it's Donald Trump pardoning Paul Manafort, and maybe whether it's Joe Biden pardoning Hunter Biden.
Not maybe.
Not maybe.
Yeah. That was a bad pardon.
That was a bad pardon.
Yeah.
Right? And then there's other ones that kind of fall into the middle categories, Is Ford pardoning Nixon, is that part of category number 1? Or does that fall into category number 3? And that's where a lot of the arguments happen. I'm just wondering what you think of that taxonomy.
Wow, I feel like I need to take notes on that because those are good. I like that. Pardons have to operate. The good thing about pardons, or one of the good things about pardons, is that they are public acts, because there is no check and balance on the pardon power, presidents reveal themselves by their pardons. That they, by the time a president comes to sign a bill, there's been a lot of negotiation with Congress. There have been horse trading, and that's not a bad thing. I'm not criticizing that, but it's not a pure act of presidential authority. Pardons are, and that's why I say in the book that pardons are like X-rays into the souls of presidents, and so I think the best thing you can say about pardons is that they were good for the country and not just good for the president or for the recipient of the pardon. That it either allowed someone to contribute to the country again, or allowed an act of forgiveness for something that should be forgiven. And so I guess that's how I would define those pardons. I mean, that's how I would see the difference between good pardons and bad pardons, but I think your taxonomy is pretty good too.
It's like the president either acting as a representative of the executive branch versus the president acting as the person, the personality.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I'm not sure that's an important distinction. I think it's sometimes good to have the president acting as an individual. If I can tell...
only if it's a good individual.
Well, yeah. Interestingly, I don't think a lot of you here, and certainly I haven't, given a lot of thought to the presidency of Warren Harding. But here's a story about Warren Harding.
Show of hands.
Oh God, who was the socialist who ran for president over and over again? Eugene Debs. Thank you. I knew a crowd like this. Not that you remember the election of 1908, but he ran for president repeatedly. And 1920, Warren Harding was elected, and Eugene Debs was in prison at the time because he had been convicted of a crime of inciting a riot simply by giving a speech against World War I. In American involvement in World War I. Certainly something that would be protected by the First Amendment today, but it wasn't. So Debs is in prison, he's getting old, and Harding is concerned that he's going to die in prison, and he doesn't think that's a good thing. So he's in prison in Atlanta, and Eugene Debs is in prison in Atlanta, and Harding passes word that Debs should get out of prison, get on a train, go to Washington, talk to the Attorney General about the possibility of a pardon, and then take himself back to prison, which Eugene Debs does, which is kind of amazing in and of itself. And then Harding decides, right around Christmas in 1921, to pardon Debs, and he invites Debs to the White House. And he says, I've always wanted to meet you, which I thought was kind of great. And that was, I thought, an excellent use of the pardon power by Warren Harding, and probably the best thing I've ever heard about Warren Harding. So there you have it.
One of the only things I've heard about Warren Harding.
That too.
So the main part of the book, the main story you tell, is the Ford pardon of Richard Nixon. And to me, the most interesting part about that story was the contrast that you draw mostly implicitly, but it's so striking. You had mentioned before how during the run-up to the 2024 presidential campaign, Donald Trump was very clear about the fact that he was running on a platform of pardoning all of the January 6th defendants and people who were convicted of storming the Capitol.
He didn't always say he was going to pardon all of them, but he wound up pardoning all of them.
Right, but it was very clear that at least pardoning most of them was going to be like one of his actions on day one,
100%.
First 100 days, whatever it was, and that became something that was part of the public discussion during the run-up to the election. As you mentioned, that's one of the reasons why you wrote the book. It was striking to me how you describe how, as Gerald Ford became president, in the wake of Richard Nixon resigning, the idea of pardoning Nixon had actually not even occurred to him. And the whole process of how that pardon happened almost happened as an afterthought. And it's such a striking contrast between our awareness of how that pardon power is used versus the way that it happened in the 1970s. And I'm just wondering if you could tell a little bit of the story.
One of the things that really surprised me in writing this book, I guess surprise isn't the right word, but it was brought home to me, was how different the news media was in the 70s from the way it was today. We had 3 television networks with a half an hour of news every night, led by Walter Cronkite. There was no cable news, there was no internet, There was no national newspaper. The New York Times was as close to a national newspaper, but that circulated basically in the New York metro area and Washington, D.C., but that's it. So you did not have the intensity of political attention and political coverage, much less the partisanship we see now. So you didn't have every issue raised the way it would be today. And so that was one reason why, you know, the pardon wasn't top of mind. But to answer your question about the papers, one of the things that came up as soon as Nixon resigned was that what would happen to his presidential papers, including, most importantly, the White House tapes. You know, the tapes that had been subpoenaed by the Watergate special prosecutor, and were, of course, very important evidence in the still unfolding Watergate investigation. Right. Before 1974, it was widely accepted that presidents as individuals owned their papers. When Lyndon Johnson left the presidency, they pulled up trucks and they took it all to Texas. And that was basically what happened with every previous president. And Nixon said, through Alexander Haig, who was his last chief of staff and Ford's first chief of staff, okay, give me my papers, including the tapes. And so they go to Ford and they say, well, should we give him the tapes? And Ford says, well, does he own them? And they go, well, anyway, Ford writes a formal note to his attorney general. Right.
I mean, the issue is that these tapes were also evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation.
Exactly. And the Watergate cover-up trial of Haldeman, Ehrlichman, John Mitchell was about to start in late 1974. So the attorney general at the time assigns a young lawyer on his staff to write a memo about the presidential papers. And so that young lawyer's name is Antonin Scalia. And Antonin Scalia writes a characteristically brilliant but cagey memo. He says, well, it's a tradition that the president gets to keep his papers. It's a custom that the president gets to keep his papers, but there is no law that says he gets to keep his papers. But Ford, very much to his credit, says, I don't care what the custom is, I'm not letting these things out the door. And Nixon starts threatening legal action to get his papers back. And this tension over the papers is part of what leads Ford to issue a pardon to try to diffuse the papers controversy.
How many of you knew that?
I didn't know until I started working on the books.
So in the current climate, with the pardons so much on our consciousness, and presidents using them in very, very personal ways, from Biden to Trump, is the pardon still a good idea?
Absolutely, because the potential is there for good pardons. Barack Obama had something in his second term called the Clemency Project. You alluded to it earlier, where he allowed low-level drug offenders who were in prison to apply for pardons. And there was a very convoluted process in multiple layers of review, but he wound up granting commutations, mostly commutations, not pardons. The difference is a pardon wipes out a conviction completely. It's as if the person was never prosecuted. So they can purchase a firearm, they can vote. It's as if they were never. A commutation simply lets someone out of prison, but their status as a convicted felon remains. And Obama mostly did commutations, but he did, I believe, about 1,200. And virtually all of them, as far as I'm aware, have not reoffended. And I think that was a good use of the presidential clemency power. Clemency is the overall power that includes both pardons and commutations.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey Toobin.